Hey, welcome to Your American Heritage. My name's Ed Bonderenka. I'm a normal, cisgendered, non-binary Christian white male. My pronouns are hey, you, and I am
not your normal fluffy insurrectionist.
These days, normal and fluffy isn't going to cut it. Working the board and the phone lines is Derek Stone. He's the hardest working man in radio. Makes it look easy. He's good. Derek also hosts Stone Cold Sports, Sundays, noon 30. Right after my friend Sean Todd, the Rock and Rev, on the intersection at noon. It's
not your normal fluffy Christian show.
So, it is day 388 of the coup. Theft of the American government by enemies both foreign and domestic. Both foreign and domestic, okay? So, not just foreign enemies and not just domestic enemies, but foreign and domestic enemies working together to subjugate you. We have far too many agents of the Chinese government in our government paying off our legislators, paying off the son of the President of the United States who then shares it with his dad, split bank account with direct deposit. Right. So we have a government that's at war with you, you who don't bow down and worship Caesar. You who won't make the government your God. A government not for the people or by the people, but by theft. A government that steals your savings and wages. Now remember, we wrestled not against just flesh and blood. I added the not just. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness. This is war. This is a fight for the soul of our nation. Literally, these debased leftists are trying to capture the souls of our children and our grandchildren. They are grooming them in the classroom like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were grooming those teenage girls she brought to him before he did not kill himself. They are teaching our kids to be subjected to them in humiliating ways, forcing them to wear masks of subjection all day like a dominatrix in black leather would, and then exposing them to salacious pornography, sexual perverts at reading time in the library, and then training them in sexual techniques. This is spiritual warfare, good versus evil. To fight this spiritual battle, you must follow the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. This isn't a religious show, but this country was founded on religious principles. My friend, historian William Federer, makes that abundantly clear in his books and writings, and we'll be talking to him later this hour, in fact, in a few minutes. So Psalm 144, once again, blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, and my fingers for battle, my loving kindness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, my shield and the one in whom I take refuge. So why don't you clasp your hands together, bow your heads, and let's go to war. Father, thank you for this country that you have placed us in. Help us protect and preserve this gift that you have given us. Please lead and guide us today and in the days to come. Please restore the prisoners in D.C. to their freedom. Please protect the truck drivers and their support from harm. Please continue to awaken the American people from their slumber, those that are not aware of the danger. And please help us retake the government from the traitors and criminals that have stolen it. Please move mightily and either bring these oppressors to a place of repentance or imprisonment. I ask you to protect this nation, deliver us from our oppressors, remove from power those who threaten our livelihood and our income and our freedoms, those that would drive down the value of our savings and the ability of us to pay our bills, those who would imprison and assault us for opposing, for speaking out against their evil totalitarian plans for us. I ask that if they will not repent, that you destroy them, that you will protect us. Amen. Well, it seems like there is trouble in Leftsville. Most of them along the lines of, geez, Carter was bad, but this Brandon guy makes Carter look good. 43 years ago this month, thousands of farmers arrived in Washington, D.C. for the second annual demonstration of the American agricultural movement. And many rode into the Capitol atop an estimated 900 tractors. Their mission? They were protesting the democratic economic policies under Carter that were harming the American farmer. Today, we have truckers camping in Ottawa, Windsor, Detroit, and across Canada protesting the leftist assault on freedom in the guise of mandating the ejection of a proven deadly concoction into otherwise healthy bodies. The Ambassador Bridge, the Blue Water Bridge, among others, shut down. Let's go, Brandon. There have been many protests of grievances in American history. Among these are the Bonus Brigade of American veterans that marched on Washington, D.C. during the Depression. These veterans of World War I had a pension coming to them. It was a bonus payout. It was a sum of money that they would be paid in 1948. Now, we're talking about the mid-1930s when this protest took place. And these gentlemen could see that given the economic policies of the left, that bonus money that they could desperately use during the Roosevelt Depression would be worth far less in 1948, especially given the ravages of inflationary pressures. So they marched on Washington in protest. Well, they weren't the first Americans to protest. I thought it would be a good idea to have historian and author and friend of the show, William J. Federer of AmericanMinute.com, to come on and talk to us about some of the rebellious activities of the American people. Hi, Bill. Welcome to the show. It's good to see you.
Hey,
how are you
Ed,
doing?
Great to be with you.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So what I thought was, given the atmosphere, the current atmosphere that we have politically, there's a lot of people who think we're going to face civil war. There's going to be some we've had complaints of an insurrection that never happened. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the, shall we say, political uprisings in the past in American history. But when we talked the other day, you mentioned the Pine Tree Riot. And I thought maybe we could start there.
Sure, yeah. So the Pine Tree Rebellion is considered the first act of revolution against the King of England. The British had the largest navy in the world, and they had masts for their ships made out of really tall pine trees that mostly came from Maine, which at that time was northern Massachusetts. It wasn't until 1820 that Maine became its own state. But the eastern white pine grew to over 150 feet tall. And again, the British had the largest navy on planet Earth. One of the other little trivias is Sir Francis Drake had discovered a tar pit down in one of the Caribbean islands. And you think, well, what's that all about? Well, they would build the ships and then coat the hulls with tar. And that way the barnacles could not attach to the wood. And that allowed the ships to go fast through the water. Other countries didn't have that type of sealant, so to speak. And so their ships would have more barnacles and be slower. And the British had ships that were faster because of this. Anyway.
Wow.
So the British would take the pine trees from Maine. And it was at first call, there was a mass tree riot. So the king claimed all of the New World and would let the people colonize, but he would send his agents on to your property, and they would just show up and they would mark the trees. They would take an axe and chop some kind of symbol on there, and then the surveyor agent would write in his book how many trees, where they were, and then you could never ever chop that tree down. That was the king's tree, and people didn't like that. So in 1772, New Hampshire had a show of resistance with a pine tree riot. In 1734, previous to that, there was a mast tree riot. Men disguised as Indians chased the king's forest surveyor out of the forest. One of the stories was they even broke into the little inn where the guy was staying and whipped him with pine sapling sticks. And anyway, so the king's agent enforced his claim to every tree in New England over 12 inches in diameter. And in 1772, the sheriff came to South Weir, New Hampshire, to arrest those who had cut down some of the king's trees. In retaliation, 30 men burst into the sheriff's room at the inn, and at nighttime with faces blackened with soot to hide their identity, and they beat the sheriff sore with switches made from pine branches. The men were later arrested and forced to pay a fine. The incident was a test of the king's authority, and some considered it the beginning of the revolution. And so that became the reason that the colonists had pine tree flags. And so Colonel Joseph Reed, who worked with George Washington, suggested at the beginning of the Revolutionary War that the flag would be white with a flag with white ground and a tree in the middle with the motto "An Appeal to Heaven." So a pine tree flag. And then July 26th of 1776, the Massachusetts General Court chose that as their flag for the Navy, that the colors be a white flag with a green pine tree and the inscription "Appeal to Heaven." And it was also called the Liberty Tree flag. And the concept behind "Appeal to Heaven" was first used by John Locke in his second treatise on civil government in 1690, regarding the rights of citizens having been denied. So it's like you have a court case and it rules against you. What do? You appeal it. Well, what if you lose that one? Well, you will finally appeal it to the Supreme Court. What if the Supreme Court is unjust and doesn't give you the right decision? Well, then
that could never happen. Come on, that's absurd.
And so the idea is you go above the government's head and you make an appeal directly to God, an appeal to heaven. So John Locke wrote this in 1690, "Where the body of the people is deprived of their right, where there lies no appeal on earth, they have just cause to make their appeal to heaven. Where there is no judicature or justice on earth to decide controversies among men, God in heaven is judge. He alone is true, is judge of the right. So in this, he should appeal to the supreme judge." And of course, that very word was mentioned in our Declaration of Independence, an appeal to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Patrick Henry made a similar in his "Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death" speech, March 23rd, 1775. He says, "An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left to us. We shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations." And Massachusetts Provincial Congress at the Battle of Lexington and Concord stated, "Appealing to heaven for the justice of our cause, we determine to die or be free." Thomas Jefferson, before he helped draft what's called the Declaration and Causes of Necessity of Taking Up Arms, about a year before he did the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson wrote, "We most solemnly before God and the world resolve to die freemen rather than live as slaves, with an humble confidence in the mercies of the supreme impartial judge and ruler of the universe." And again, the Declaration of Independence, a year later, July 4th, 1776, says, "Appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states." And the American Navy flew that flag, and Colonel John Glover of Marblehead, Massachusetts, was the first one to be the head of the American Navy. And anyway, George Washington put up the money personally to outfit several ships. One of them was named the USS Hannah, which was the name of John Glover's daughter. And it captured the British ship HMS Unity. It was the first prize taken by the U.S. Navy. And Washington also helped pay for John Glover to fit out other ships, Franklin, Warren, Hancock, and Lee. And anyway, but just it goes back to that pine tree flag, that idea that we're going to not let the king come onto our property and take our trees. And
I'd always felt that pine tree symbol, actually, because it tapers and points heavenwards, that was part of the symbolism. But I didn't realize that there was a pine tree rebellion or incident behind that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So the King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy, with him at the top, with this global empire that eventually was 13 million square miles, a half a billion people, all of India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, countries in Africa, from Egypt down to South Africa. I mean, he was a globalist. And America's founders, they didn't like this one world government guy dictating what's going to happen in America. And so we had this original Pine Tree Rebellion, and there were several others, but that was a major one. And anyway, just as you had mentioned, wanting to talk about some of these rebellions, that's a key one.
Yeah. So then we formed the government. Actually, if I recall right, we won what we call the Revolutionary War, what I consider the first Civil War. But we won that war. But then there were some disputes with our present government, right? Some of the citizens were kind of unhappy with some of the decisions that the federal government made. And one was Shays Rebellion, was it? Was another the Whiskey Rebellion?
Yeah, so the Shays Rebellion was in 1786 and 87. And so this is after the revolution ended, and we're under the Articles of Confederation, and before our U.S. Constitution. And the American government was wanting to pay back war debts and pay the veterans, and so they decided to push through taxes on the population. And the population was like, these are guys that just got done fighting in battles against the king. And one of the reasons they were fighting was they didn't want to be taxed without representation. And they, as a local area, weren't consulted about being taxed, and they didn't like the tax. And so in 1787, Daniel Shay and his several hundred men marched to the Springfield Armory and to overthrow it. And anyway, the federal government was not in a place to put down the rebellion. But anyway, it finally was put down, and that was key because at the time you had the states wanting to be really independent and not form a federal government. And this sort of illustrated that the country was about to be fractured from within, and the federal government had no power to prevent this. Why is this important? The British were itching to come back and conquer us. And if they could see some legitimate fracturing and internal weakness, they would have very easily come back. And later, even during the War of 1812, they tried to encourage weakness and fracturing, but what later got called critical race theory. But they would go to the Indians and say, you were mistreated by the Americans, and therefore we'll give you guns and arms so that you can do an insurrection and fight the Americans. And well, the British really didn't care about the Indians. They were just stirring them up because they wanted to create a disunity. Jesus says a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. So critical race theory, that term was invented by Karl Marx, but prior to that, it was simply sowing division within a country. It's sort of like introducing an autoimmune disease to the body politic. You get the country to attack, you get the body to attack itself from the inside. So an autoimmune disease is where your immune system ends up attacking your own organs and views them as a foreign thing that needs to be attacked. And so uh, that's why the autoimmune diseases are so dangerous. And
Well,
but
thank God that can't happen to us, politically today. I mean, that's history, right? That has no application to the present
yeah, well,
much.
even during the Revolution, there was a British general, Johnny Burgoyne. He lands in Canada and he meets with the Mohawk Indians and he promises them money for scalps. And so they would go ahead of the British Army and scalp Americans and cause panic and mayhem. And it was very effective, but something went wrong. The Indians couldn't tell who was an American and who was a British loyalist. We all sort of looked the same to them. And so they
Oh,
were
that's
there
so racist.
in
We
the
all
New
look
York,
alike.
they were there in one of the fortified settlements in the north area of New York. And the British come up and kill and scalp the people, but not realizing that they were British loyalists. And one of them was a girl named Jane McCrae, who was engaged to a guy named David Jones, who was fighting with General Johnny Burgoyne. And the Indians would come in at night with their scalps on sticks and do their hooping and hollering dances. And David Jones recognized that one of these scalps had this really long, pretty hair. And they were really, really close to the settlement where his fiance was. And he put two and two together. Sure enough, the Indians went in there and killed and scalped her. And so the soldiers go to this British General Burgoyne and say, "What were you thinking?" And so he has to meet with the Indians and tell them to tone it down. Well, the Indians don't know tone it down. They know on and off. And they're at peace, they're at war. And when it's war, it's total war. They don't know any limited warfare. Like we tell our soldiers when they would fight in Iraq, now don't shoot at them when they're crossing the street. Wait till they get all set up and they're shooting at you again. Then you can shoot back at them, you know.
Yeah.
But
Rules of engagement.
yeah, the Indians didn't do that. They would just kill men, women, and children, anybody. And when Burgoyne tells them to tone it down, they get offended and leave. And now you have an entire British army in the middle of the dense New York forest, and they don't know where they're at. The Indians had been their eyes and ears. And so the Americans get the advantage and win. It's called the Battle of Saratoga, and we capture 6,000 British troops. That would be a big deal today. And then the news ricochets over to France. Ben Franklin is the ambassador. He goes into the court of Louis the 16th and says, "We just captured 6,000 British." And the King of France is like, "Gee, maybe I'll risk getting into another war with England if you're going to win like that." And so he did. And once the French got into the war, it turned into a global war because the French and English had colonies all around the world. And so now Britain had to spread its resources around.
So that was all because of playing the race card. Is that basically it?
Yeah, yeah. But so Shays' Rebellion, because of the seriousness of it, resulted in several more states saying, "I guess we need to have a stronger federal government so that we don't fracture."
Well, America's enemies have long tried to weaken us by dividing us, and they're continuing to do it today. So come on back after the break and join me with Bill Federer, and we're going to talk more about this. Thanks for returning to Your American Heritage. Yeah, we're on the front lines. Many are on the front lines. We need to pray for those on the front lines. We need to get on the front lines ourselves, even in our own personal domains. We need to go up to the desk and say, "No, I'm not putting on a mask. Thank you." We need to stand up for our rights and ensure that they're not taken away. Somebody who speaks about our history of doing that is my guest today, William Federer of AmericanMinute.com. We're talking about the American propensity for standing up to tyranny. Bill, we didn't talk about this, that we would talk about this, but I'm reminded of the Boston Tea Party. And a few months ago, I had a guest on, Lieutenant Colonel Howard Benjamin, a retired history teacher. And he had lived in England for a while, married a British woman, and he's returned to the States now, and he writes. And we were talking about the Boston Tea Party. And Howard told me that, well, actually, it wasn't as portrayed in our history books. These guys weren't a bunch of liberty-minded patriots, that they were actually a group of smugglers whose business model was being infringed upon by the British government, who was dictating that all tea sold now had to be done by an organization that was monopolistic in nature and backed by the British government, the royal government. So that led to a bunch of guys dressing up as Indians and throwing a bunch of tea in the harbor. What about that?
Yeah, so the British took over Bengal over by India, and they ended up rearranging their entire economy, making people grow stuff that they normally didn't grow, but that they could sell more on a global market. And it disrupted them so much that when they had a famine, and during this famine, 1770 to 1773 in Bengal, they estimate 10 million people died. 10 million people died in Bengal when the British took over Bengal. And the British East India Company was going bankrupt. It was the most successful company that the British had. And so the British Empire didn't want the British East India Company to go bankrupt because it was a very important part of the empire. And so they were going to have taxes raised on the people in England on tea and these different imported items to pay back help the British East India Company recoup its losses. But the people of England had their resistance, sort of like their Tea Party. They said, no, we don't want to be taxed. And so the British Parliament says, okay, we'll tax the colonies. We'll increase the taxes on the colonies. We'll prevent the Dutch and French and Spanish and others that were importing stuff. We'll give the British East India Company a monopoly so that only their tea can be sold, and we'll cut out the middlemen. So instead of the tea companies selling to merchants, and then the merchants would sell to the tea shops, this was the British East India Company selling directly to the tea shops, putting out of business all these merchantmen. And then they forbade the colonies from printing their own currency. That many of the colonies had their own currency, and they, were coining stuff. And the British said, no, we're going to control that. And it was a crackdown designed to help the British East India Company recoup its losses from the 10 million that died in Bengal. And these colonies were like, why are you trying to pay back the British East India Company from us? And so that was why they were very against it.
Were some of the people, what he was saying, these were people who weren't so much, you want to say, acting out of a patriotic notion, but they were more like trying to get rid of the competition. They had been bringing in tea, and now they were told only the British East India Company could sell tea in North America, which was putting economic pressure on them. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. The general sentiment was tremendously against the British. So in Boston, they went to the person in charge of collecting the taxes, and they started throwing rocks at the house, and then they looted the house, and they trashed the house, and they set it on fire. I mean, the British had to flee the different, colonial governors. John Adams was there in Boston during this time. The British began to institute called the writs of assistance, where they would read everyone's emails. Oh, excuse me, all their letters. And so they would open your letters and they would read them, and then they would confiscate stuff. So today, the government has these practices where if they pull your car over and you happen to have a large amount of cash, well, they can seize your cash. And then, even if you didn't do anything wrong, and then you can spend 10 years trying to get back, and they'll seize your assets. Well, that's what the British were doing. They were seizing people's farms and assets just on a suspicion. And it was after that, when we finally broke away, that we put on these 10 amendments saying that, there's no, the government can't just do a search and seizure anytime at once. It can't just read your emails anytime at once. It can't take away your privacy. It can't survey, do surveillance on you without your permission. It can't use your data without your permission. At least that's what they're supposed to not
That sounds
do.
like such a nice system. We ought to have a system like that, eh? I mean,
Yeah.
wow. Like my son 20 years ago, he had sold a car or something, and he was driving another car and he got pulled over, some suspicious of something, and the cops found $1,000 in his pocket. And they said, well, that must have been from a drug deal, and they confiscated it. And even though he was never charged with anything, he couldn't get the $1,000 back without actually hiring a lawyer and suing the police department to get his money back. And I believe those laws are still on the books, which is, it's atrocious. It's un-American, as you were alluding to.
Yeah. And so it's disturbing to see that several of the reasons that America broke from Britain, that we're instituting those again right now. But yeah, we lived in a neighborhood and had a neighbor who was a professor at a college, and he was from Bengal, and so we would talk about all the things the British would do, and they eventually would do their critical race theory. So they would go to one kingdom and give them guns, and go to another kingdom and give them guns, and then stir up ancient animosities between the kingdoms until they broke out into fighting. And after they fought each other really good and bloodied each other and weakened each other, then the British would come in to restore order, and they would take control of both kingdoms. And they would do this again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. And other colonizing powers would do this as well. Karl Marx just gave it the name critical theory. That's where you observe a country and study all the groups, and you categorize them as victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then you go to the ones that have grievances and you organize them. You stir them up. You push them to riot and then violence. And then you blame the leader of the country for all the problems. And when the country gets panicky enough, you do your coup or your rigged election, and you replace the leader with a puppet.
As you were talking about that, I was reminded of the movie based on the Rudyard Kipling book, The Man Who Would Be King, that had Sean Connery in it. And there were a couple of British soldiers who go up towards what appears to be Afghanistan. And they do exactly what you're talking about. They take one tribe and they listen to their grievances and work them up against another tribe and actually build a kingdom doing that. It was quite fascinating. I was exactly reminded of what you were talking about on a smaller scale. That's kind of interesting. So, Bill, there was another episode in American history called the Whiskey Rebellion. Why don't you tell us something about that?
The Whiskey Rebellion, 1791, you had the federal government decided to tax whiskey. Now, the explanation is important, that farmers would grow their crops and then bring them to the market. And it was expensive bringing them to the market because you'd have to go to some city where there's a port. And so a lot of them would turn their corn and rye and whatever into alcohol and then bring that to port. It was easier to do that. And when they would cross state line to state line to state line and so forth, and all these taxes in between. By the time they got it to the port, they couldn't sell it for what they paid and all the taxes to get it there. And so when the federal government put on the taxes, and some think that Alexander Hamilton, again, he's the head of the Department of Revenue, he's trying to figure out how to raise revenue, and he pushed this through, this tax. And now, for the big picture, is you had two groups of people in America, more or less the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The idea is that one group wanted a structure with a stronger central government so that you could have a navy to defend ourselves from outside attack, so that we could have a stable currency, so we could trade with European countries, and so that you could, get things done with an efficient centralized government. The other people, the Anti-Federalists, wanted a weaker central government because they had this foresight that sometime in the future, the federal government might turn into another King George III Frankenstein monster and want to take away all rights and freedoms and revert back to a dictatorship. And so these two are battling each other. Now, Hamilton was in the centralized camp. And so he is in charge of the U.S. Treasury. He wants he's trying to deal with European countries, and they're like, we're not going to do anything with America. You've got that worthless Continental, and we lent you money and you didn't pay us back from the war, and don't talk to us until you can show some stability. So Hamilton's like, look, we need to have a strong central government, and where Jefferson was the opposite. Now, so the whiskey is being taxed, and you finally have a bunch of these farmers that were like, look, we just fought a revolution because we didn't like being taxed, and here we are, our own government being taxed. And so you get a large group there that were in Western Pennsylvania that had insisted on not paying the tax and start confiscating things. And so the federal government sends an army. And at the head of the army is George Washington. He is the commander-in-chief. This is the only time that a sitting U.S. president acted as commander-in-chief, by actually getting on his horse and leading the army. And he went to Western Pennsylvania to put it down. They caught the people, the ringleaders of the Whiskey Rebellion, and George Washington forgave them and let them go. Now, that was significant because every other country in world history, if you have somebody leading a resistance movement and you caught them, you would have them hung or their head chopped off. And it would send this fear that nobody else would question the government. Well, when Washington forgave him, it broke that mold, and everybody's like, gee, America really is different. You're not going to turn into another form of a dictatorship. And it encouraged the representative government that if you're going to bring change, you have to work through the process of electing your representatives and so forth.
Which is where we got our constitutional form of government from, the central government, the federalism that we have now, which unfortunately has lent itself to be rather dictatorial. And now we don't forgive people. We put them in the D.C. jail for over a year and let them rot.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, we even have it in our Constitution, a quick and speedy trial and no cruel and unusual punishment. And what's the worst punishment that prison camps do to people? They put them in isolation. And yet we're doing that to our own American citizens. No arms were used in this quote unquote insurrection. And now they're finding out that it was basically a coup. It was FBI had infiltrated it, planned it. It was an entrapment. There's videos of uh, people dressed in black breaking into the Capitol, smashing things, and there were no attendees at the Trump rally dressed like that. And there was even one person that I talked with that was there outside the Capitol, and they had their camera, their phone, and they took a 360 of the entire area, and the people were singing praise songs and God Bless America. And then she went back to her hotel, turned on the TV, and saw that exact spot where she was at with violence and bicycle racks being shoved and the police being attacked. And then she noticed in her video, the bleachers in the background were completely constructed. But in the video she saw on TV, the bleachers in the background had not finished being constructed.
Wait a minute.
In other words, they had staged it ahead of time and just released all these videos right at that moment. And there's people
That's
that were
the first
there.
I've heard this.
Yeah, and there's another video of inside of the rotunda, and there's the police and the rioters, and they're pushing their baton back and forth, and then somebody says, "Stop, stop! Let's try it this way, and this looks a little bit more convincing. Now let's try it again." And then they would push, and go, "Okay, let's." It was all rehearsed, and the people that were there that day said, "Yeah, they went through." And they were snapping pictures with their camera. Some thought they were getting a free tour of the Capitol. Others, it was cold that day and they thought they were being nice and let in. The doors to the Capitol have enormous magnets at the top, and you have to be buzzed in. The doors will not open, yet there are pictures of these doors being buzzed from the inside and opening up from the inside. And it's 2,300 police officers for one building. The Capitol is the most protected building on planet Earth. Nobody gets in there unless they let you. So now it's coming out that instead of people being stirred up from a Trump speech, you got video of a guy named Ray Epps the night before, over and over again saying, "We don't just need to go there. We need to break into the Capitol. We need to go into the Capitol." He's like, and then Tucker Carlson's like, "Okay, FBI, why isn't this guy on your list? Why is he a plant? Was he an FBI instigator?" You know, sort of like that Governor Whitmer. They were in Michigan. They caught a kidnapping plot. They found out that a dozen guys, half of them were FBI agents.
I know.
Were planning everything, paying for everything, organizing everything, and the other half were these low IQ guys that they'd call them and say, "We need you to be there. You got to really? Do I got to be there? Yeah, you got to be there." And then they would catch him. It's like, duh, you're the ones organizing and planning it all. And so this
that was a dry run for January 6th. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you look at what the CIA has done in other countries, and what the KGB has done in other countries for 70 years. This is how they would take over countries. We would do it to help keep countries from falling to the Soviets, and they would do it to have countries go back under the Soviet circle of influence. The only difference is this time, these tactics have been used on our own soil. And when people don't know the history, they fall for it. But more and more people are getting educated. And they're saying, "Gee, this looks a whole lot like, Hitler staging the burning of the Reichstag and blaming it on his political opponents, and decides to do investigations and rounds them up and has them shot without a trial. And then Germany transitions from a republic to a dictatorship. And Stalin did a similar thing in Russia, where there was an anti-Stalinist movement that was gaining momentum. And Stalin had a friend, Sergei Kirov, who was the party boss of Leningrad, a very popular person. They built a statue to him. And Sergei was giving these speeches praising Stalin. And so Stalin had an idea. He would assassinate his friend Sergei Kirov and eliminate a potential rival and blame it on the anti-Stalinists. And everybody would believe it because the anti-Stalinists didn't like Stalin and they didn't like Sergei. Stalin used that as an excuse to round up, detain, and kill over 1 million people in the first Great Purge of 1936 to 38. And Erdogan did a similar thing in Turkey. right? So he staged a coup against himself that was so milquetoast. I mean, all he did is go up in an airplane, flew in a circle, and landed. And then he pulls out a list of 30,000 of his political enemies, has them arrested, zip-tied, taken away, and they've never been seen since. And now he's ruling as a dictator with no political opponents. And so that's the typical strategy: is you stage an attack on the Capitol and blame it on the innocent, your political opponents. And then you use that as an excuse to investigate them and destroy them and go after them, because the goal is to transition the country from a representative government bottom up to a dictatorship top down. Yeah, well, the purpose of history is to learn trends and the patterns of human nature, so that you can understand what's going on today. Human nature is not changed. You have this lust for power. And it's important to know these stories, and I appreciate you bringing them to everyone's attention.
Great. Well, thanks, Bill. It's been very good having you on the show again. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
I'm thrilled to be on with you, Ed.
Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our allotted time together. I appreciate you joining us today with author, speaker, and historian William J. Federer of AmericanMinute.com. Please avail yourself of everything he has to offer at his website. Get the email, get the newsletter emailed to you on a daily basis. In these times where America faces these challenges, we have to remember where we came from in order to figure out how we're going to get where we want to go, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to learn from the lessons of what works from the past. We need to stand up to tyranny. We need to resist the oppression. We need to rely on Almighty God to help us in that effort. So, God bless America, and America bless God. And I encourage you to share these broadcasts via podcast by going to whamradio.com and looking at the podcast tab, and you can find the links to all the Wham shows there. Share them with your friends. Spread freedom. God bless you.